Hello, everybody, on this last session of the conference. And Jenny and I are going to attempt to structure our reflections around the title of the conference, in the sense that we'll start by looking back and then we'll move into looking forwards. So I'm going to kick off in a minute by looking back, and then I'll hand over to Jenny, who will continue with this, and then she'll change gear and start looking forwards, focusing on the very big question of how we reset the conversation on drugs and development. And then finally, she'll hand over to me, and I'll look again on the theme of looking forward, but looking at some of the more practical things we aim to do under the umbrella of drugs and disorder, and subsequently CVAD. And I'm hoping Jenny is feeling a bit more sharper than I am at the moment. I'm feeling absolutely exhausted, and I know that Jenny's also in the midst of Storm Dudley, having lost her power just a few minutes ago. So I'm very pleased that she's back and with us. But I'm going to kick off now, and I'm going to start by highlighting an underlying theme both to our research and throughout this conference, and this is the issue of borders and boundaries. And the project has been interested in fact, obsessed by challenging, probing, and transgressing different types of borders and boundaries. And we've been having a conversation in the project, inspired by the development economist Albert Hirschman's idea about the art of trespassing, and the need to question and to subvert the taken for granted existence and assume legitimacy of borders. Of course, borders, they are about projecting power as well as about protecting it, and to trespass involves challenging power relations, and inevitably to do that trespassing involves distributional effects and transition costs, and we need to think carefully about who bears the costs of moving or erasing boundaries. So I'm going to start off by just mentioning three different types of boundaries, and then Jenny's going to take over and to mention some others, and to kind of relate this to discussions we've been having in the conference. So the first is about disciplinary boundaries. The subject matter of our research is incredibly challenging. How do you study something which is illegal, that's liminal, that's constantly moving and mutating, that's multi-leveled and multi-sited? And as academics, we're frequently invoked of the need to employ more integrated and multidisciplinary mixed methods and approaches. And we've tried to follow this and embody this in our research, and it's been reflected in the conference as well. We draw on different methods, forms of data, and conceptual frameworks. Theo even complimented it as that we're geographers now, although we regard ourselves as interdisciplinarians. But it's not easy. We all talk about interdisciplinarity, but there are very strong boundaries and enforcement mechanisms in place linked to professional incentives, academic audiences, ethical codes, different understandings of research rigor, and so on. So I think we've only been partially successful in these acts of trespassing, and I think there's still a long way to go in terms of thinking, what do we mean by interdisciplinary approaches to studying drugs? The second boundary that we've been looking at, particularly today, is about the fields of policy we're studying: drugs development and peace building, and also public health. These are fields which tend to be sharply divided or siloed. They involve different actors, institutions, organizational cultures, funding mechanisms, and so forth. And again, there are very strong vested interests in erecting and policing boundaries between these fields: financial, institutional, and the political. And yet, as we've zoomed in on our research sites and studied drugs and development as phenomena, these boundaries make no sense whatsoever. And from the perspective of borderland communities who are on the receiving end of counter-narcotics policies, development, and peace building, these divisions just don't conform with their everyday realities. And I guess a couple of things that we've been looking at today show how we have been trying to trespass and break down these policy boundaries. The policy lab that Karen has referred to, in his attempt to bring together policymakers from different backgrounds and experiences to have difficult conversations and challenge established boundaries. We've also talked about the participatory and visual-based approaches, which aim to capture the life worlds of borderland communities, and in so doing, kind of dissolve this kind of siloed thinking around different policy areas. But again, I think we've only been partially successful in this boundary kind of transgression. And I think in moving forwards, as well as thinking about looking back, we need to pay close attention to the political economy of policymaking and institutional boundaries and how they are preventing change from taking place. Even though there's widespread recognition of what some of the key changes are needed to humanize drug policies, I think these institutional sets of interests are preventing them from translating into policy and practice. And thirdly, and finally, from my side, there are the territorial boundaries we've been looking at. These are the sharply delineated international borders, which are both zones of opportunity and constraint, where illicit economies are constantly trying to trespass and transgress, and where we see forms of policing and regulation which are attempting to kind of stem those kinds of flows. We've also seen how COVID has had an impact on border hardening and the negative impacts that's had on cross-border livelihoods and trade. And we've also heard about alternative forms of territorialization. These may be kind of quite violent if you think about the kinds of boundaries that are carved out by armed groups like the Taliban or FARC. But also we've heard about how, in talking to borderland communities, alternative spatial imaginaries emerge through going into the life worlds of borderlanders. And if we think, for example, about the comic strip of Jangul and how his life was all about challenging these kind of boundaries and subverting them as he smuggled heroin from Afghanistan to Moscow. I just now hand over to Jenny to take this forward further.
Yeah, so I want to explore three other boundaries. So first of all, the boundary around legality, because I heard how illegality imbues drugs with particular properties, but it also criminalizes that boundary. I remember we heard how peasants consider themselves illegal. That has all sorts of implications for livelihoods and futures. And then borderlands are often portrayed as having a comparative advantage in illegality. And we've heard about how we were to around drugs, a big debate in our field. This doesn't necessarily mean we could favour the poorest, because legislation itself can have distribution effects. And I just wanted to remind of those of you who perhaps have read their philosophy of Walter Benjamin's question from his ago, when does violence become law? So how orders, which are apparently kind of establishing norms, are often mediated, in fact, by violence. And then social and symbolic boundaries. So we've heard a lot in the conference about the fuzzy zones of transition between the centre and the margins, and on the margins and the peripheries, etc. It's a civilizational discourse between the division between the barbaric world and the civilized centre. Pat and Theo talked about that, and then today referred to borderlands. If you talk to policymakers, often they'll think security, and that's all they think about. So it's another boundary that. And then in the social and symbolic boundaries that we have in our heads, there's we could put in the whole issue that's emerged quite a lot in the conference about stigmatization and marginalization. That even in the health and drugs, people who take drugs have fallen into that for various reasons, stigmatization that they feel. And we see this particularly in communities that are marginalized. And I think a big theme that's come out for all of us in this field is, for instance, in Colombia, the Afro-Colombian indigenous communities in Colombia, how they've been and there's symbolic narratives around those communities, making it incredibly hard for them to move forward in their livelihoods at the same time as they protect their culture and identity, etc. And they're constantly faced with the so-called progressive modernizers of the extractive agro-industries rather than develop peasant farming. And then we have the Shan and the Kachin in Myanmar, and the whole way that counter-narcotics policy and our narratives around the state create symbolic ins and outsiders, which has huge effect on whose voices are at discussion. And then the boundary, and what I often have talked about the way the boundaries we put between the violences that matter and those that don't. So we might consider the violence of armed actors as a violence we have to address, but we don't consider the violence of state actors. We don't consider the violence in the intimate space, that there is an apparent pacification. Often the question isn't experienced by women, how is it experienced by children, etc. So there's an awful lot of issues around the here. And the way violence plays a very important role in policing boundaries, in boundaries. Difficult to erase once those boundaries were erected. So very important, I think, to think of violence as something that constructs orders, gives the appearance of pacification sometimes, but actually people hate disorder, right? So they hate the notion of not knowing where there's uncertainty in life. So I think that we often don't see that violence is behind the apparent order that people are apparently accepting, but because they have no choice and they certainly don't consent to it freely. Okay, so that's looking backwards, and they're just some of the rich ideas that have emerged in the course of the conversation. Let's look forward and let's try and be practical about, well, what could we do? What could we do in practice? And I think today in particular, some very important ideas have come out. So I wanted 3 points. The first is to think, well, looking forward, the immediate short term, and we know we have temporalities. The immediate, I think one of the things that we must never forget is that the context of Colombia, Myanmar and Afghanistan are extremely uncertain this very moment in time. We know what's going on in Myanmar and Afghanistan in general, but perhaps people don't. If you're not working in Latin America, you might not know there's a presidential election which is going to the peace process as well as attitudes and policies towards drugs. So we have a really difficult time for the 3 countries we've been working on. It does mean, however, that if we were to sort of help to move the framework of discussion forward, it could have could really help the process in those 3 countries. And I also think that it might help us not just to sort of think about the drugs issue per se, but to think of how we can address the issue of militarized authoritarian politics, the plethora of armed groups and militias, and impoverishment and to starvation, which is clearly a real threat in Afghanistan. And Patrick today mentioned, however, that you can still work around the edges. I thought this was a very important point, that we can, using educational tools, for instance, there's still things that can be done in the immediate. And I don't think we should ever forget that. Things seem very grim, but I think we can always act, and even if it is in those edges, building towards something that can make change. And that's my second point about moving forward, is in a sense, when we're talking about looking forward, it's about where does change come from? Who generates the change? Who drives the change? And it's been very much a part of today's conversation, and that the change has to come at so many levels. And we've questioned all through the conference, well, whose voices are in the conversation we want to reset? Who's in the room, and how do they get into the room? And how do they change the status quo and the norms? And amongst all the actors in the field of drugs. And I think what has really come to me today, for instance, is the importance of new relationships. If we're going to reset the conversation, there has to be new relationships in the way we have the conversation. And that involves new attitudes towards knowledge. So I think the whole idea of knowledge exchanges between those with experiential knowledge on the ground, the people that we've been working with on the borderlands in their everyday lives, but also the knowledge of the practitioners and the knowledge of academics and policymakers. So respecting these knowledges and realizing we can learn from each other. And when we come to learn from each other, I had a great conversation, it was short and cut short, but with Murdo about what he called the importance of operational research to him. So if we get better relationships between academics and practitioners, and the donors understand the significance of that, we can actually start to make the research knowledge usable at the same time as that research knowledge takes on board the practical obstacles that people face on the ground. And that involves these new conversations between the scientists and the engineers, if you like. And sometimes these conversations aren't always comfortable. Mandy said that in one of the discussions today. I think we should be aware that there could be conflicts with us, amongst all of us, in terms of, and there should be disagreements from which we can make bring productive new ideas in around the table. And this issue about who's in the room and how they get there, and this has to be through agency. So I think I mentioned in my very first conversation with Jonathan after his keynote, Carmen in Colombia, in the Voices from the Borderland, who gained her agency and became an activist in the process of having to deal with all sorts of issues around drugs and violence. And I think that this sense of how you recognize that agency, how it gets built to bring the change into the room. And Jay Kula in the chat, she said, well, how do we connect research and activism? Often we talk about practitioners and NGOs and more formal organizations, but let's not forget the activists. Let's not forget the people who become the change agents on the ground. And I think one of the ways as academics we can engage with that, which I've always found incredibly important, and in fact, it's a field that emerged very much from Latin America, is participatory research methodologies, where we actually, the methodology itself builds in the respect for the experiential knowledge. And I think Annenberg also said this about how that has to be built in from the outset. And Ozala showed how by having to work in Afghanistan with people in multiple innovative ways in order to embrace their own knowledge, but also communicate the knowledge that comes from the research. And I think this project has been very good using comics, and the comics in Myanmar that you've probably been looking at. And then Juan just not long ago mentioned the Twitter space as another space of communication. I'm not sure about that one, but I'll take his word for it. We have to engage with it. So we can't ignore social media, but of course, for many of the communities we work with, that isn't an option. But the important issue, I think, is spaces where we can have the kind of knowledge exchanges across all the levels and ensure that those are living the everyday realities, their voices in the room. And that when the voice is in the room, there's a possibility that they can actually change the status quo. That seems to me incredibly important. We need to change the status quo, which brings me to our final point in terms of moving forward. And then I will hand over to Jonathan, which is, okay, I've talked about very practical things, the immediate, the change process we need and how we bring all people together in pursuing change and acting. I don't want to forget the need for the big vision, the new framework in this resetting of the conversation. And I think we've got so many elements in over these last few days to build that new vision and that new framework, and the communicating of it and the building with people on the ground as well as in the policy community is going to be our great challenge. So one of the aspects of this is the questioning of what is meant by development. I mean, some of us who've been in this field for a long time, it's been questioned for a long time, but still we don't seem to be able to rethink the political economy, which assumes that progress involves extractive economies, it involves market-driven logics. And Jonathan said something in one of the discussions we had preparing for this was how drugs becomes a lens on the problems with that approach to the economy. It is so many issues looking at drugs about the nature of our political economy, the nature of extraction and capitalist economies, and how they impact on peasant agriculture and the possibility of a new kind of food security and a new kind of culturally sensitive way in which peasants can become actors. And so what I would conclude by saying is, let's feed drugs into other conversations. let's feed drugs into conversations about climate change. We are dealing with land issues, with the environment, with ecology. Let's feed it into health discussions, as the health colleagues gave us so many insights into the importance of that. Let's feed it into the discussion of inequalities that are so embedded in everything we're doing, and not only in the global south. I was very struck by the fact that our colleagues from health talked about the impact of inequalities in the global south and amongst consumers of drugs, but also in the global north. The UNODC have shown how those most liable to be impacted by addictions from taking drugs in the global north are from poor communities. And then I think to rethink the meaning of order, that's another big framework that we need, as something that involves participation, involves voice and consent, and not violence. And I think these are some of the big frameworks that have come out of this discussion, which I have found enormously enriching. And I'm going to pass over now to Jonathan to conclude.
Thanks very much, Jenny. And I'll be really brief. And I'll be a bit more prosaic as well. I'll just say a little bit about some of our things that we're planning following up this conference. First thing to say is we've got a lot of outputs in the pipeline. So when you to look at Expo after they will be open until 5 o'clock apparently, but keep looking at the websites. New things will be coming out of the pipeline, academic pieces as well as policy pieces. The other thing to stress here is we really are committed to the partnerships we developed in this project, and they will continue beyond the lifetime of the project, and also our strong commitment to working in the regions where we have these relationships. I was especially encouraged by the session yesterday and the presentation from other projects, and I'd like to just say that resetting the conversation, which picks up a bit on what Jenny was just saying, it's not just about the policy conversation, it's about the theory, the concepts, the language we're using, which is really important to resetting how we think about and understand drugs and its fundamental relationship to development. So I think the fact that there are 3 other very significant research projects talking together with the Drugs and Disorder Project is very important. I think we have the capacity to help move those conversations forward. And I think this has to be a fundamentally collaborative exercise. As academics, we exist in a very competitive funding environment, but I think there's real scope here for collaboration and working together on developing the kind of the theoretical tools that we need to engage with these kinds of issues moving forward. The only thing I wanted to stress about the rethinking of policy is that, you know, we have a strong commitment to pluralizing the voices and the types of evidence that are used, and the Voice of the Borderlands is one kind of manifestation of this. But yeah, we've also stressed about this is not an easy exercise, and there are divergent voices and perspectives. Pat emphasized this earlier, and there are dangers of ventriloquism. And I think when we started out this project, we didn't talk about decolonization, but that was very much at the heart of what we were thinking in terms of trying to bring out the perspectives of people who are on the margins in the developing world, whose voices have been missing or ignored or not sufficiently taken account of. So I think there's a lot of exciting work going on at the moment around the decolonization of drug issues, and I hope our work can continue to contribute and add to that. So finally, any research project worth its salt comes up with new questions and new agendas, and that's precisely what the GCR, our Drugs and Disorder Project, has done. And CVAD, that I briefly talked about on the first day, is aiming to take forward those agendas. In what we're doing with this project is opening up the analytical lens to look at illicit economies more broadly rather than a sole focus on drugs, and to see how it relates to contemporary development processes in the shadow, as Jenny has mentioned, of an unfolding climate emergency. And we're also opening up the geographical lens. So we're not only looking at the borderlands, but we want to look at the metropolitan centres. How do processes of change that are happening place in Nangarhar and Shan State relates to things that are going on in Dubai and London, Kunming and Beijing. We need to trace the flows and the entanglements, and to see just how inherently related they are to processes of licit development as well as illicit. So that's really just to give you a kind of a taste of what we're planning to do following on from this conference. But I want to finish finish now by thanking, first of all, I want to thank some people who are behind this workshop. In particular, I would like to thank the SOAS team who were instrumental in putting this workshop together. Jay, Karen, Pat, Francis, Kat and Louise. They worked incredibly hard and with a huge amount of creativity in pulling this together. And it's been a real pleasure to work with you all on this. And I'm really proud of what we've all done in the project as well as in this conference. I'd also like to thank everybody in the wider GCRF Drugs and Disorder project. We had 12 organizations, some 60 researchers, and in particular the teams from the 3 countries who have shown incredible fortitude and bravery and commitment to the project, and they've been a real inspiration to all of us. Just to embarrass Jenny, I'd like to thank Jenny. She's the chair of the International Advisory Group. She didn't realize what she was getting into when she said yes, when we offered her that position. I don't think she realized just how much she would get dragged into this project, but she has been amazing in kind of every step of the way, and just her participation in this conference is one manifestation of that. She's really been committed to this and been a great source of ideas and inspiration to all of us. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you. Oh, sorry, not finally, sorry. I'd like to thank Autumn Live, who have done a great job in managing this conference and dealt very efficiently with all the technical issues. I'd like to thank UKRI, GCI, for funding the project. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for participating. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found that there's some value in it. I hope it's established some relationships that will continue into the future, and some conversations that will continue into the future. The last thing I've been asked to say is, please, if you can take a minute to look at the evaluation and do the evaluation. And the expo and networking sections will be open until 5. So please go there and make use of that, and stay safe. And we hope to meet many of you, hopefully in real life in the future. So thank you and goodbye for now.